So I think that's recording. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to upload this. The students came back from holidays, which is great, and then I went to look for my copy of the book and I couldn't find it. And so I just downloaded an audio version, and I only got around to listening to it again today and yesterday. And it was great to listen to it again. So the book I'm talking about is What Ghandi Says by Norman Finkelstein. And it was great to listen to it again, having done Gene Sharp a little while ago, because I really was able to contrast the two different understandings of nonviolence. So just to recap on Gene Sharp's understanding of nonviolence. His methodology was to get a community to demonstrate to itself in increasing numbers the understanding that the regime which was oppressing it was legitimate. And in the exercise of demonstrating that to itself in greater and greater numbers, it could understand that any move to topple the regime would have safety in numbers. So it really is born out of a desire to avoid or minimise violence because of the understanding of the suffering that it brings. The strategy is to get people to demonstrate to each other that they are willing to act together and therefore dissuade the regime from bringing violence upon them. Ghandi has a very different understanding of non-violence, and one that I did find, again on re-listening to it, very terrifying, or one that would, require so much courage to enact. So why, I guess, we should start a little bit about the book. Why did Norman choose to write about Ghandi? He said that, he's written over 100 works, each of which, volume goes for some 100 pages, and that very few people actually read Ghandi. And that's because he doesn't have a particularly well laid out rational doctrine or strategy that you can follow. His writing is contradictory. It is infused with religious zeal, and it's often, and it's copious. So because of that, he's difficult to understand, and consequently people don't read him. Norman Finkelstein says that Ghandi has been reduced to a mantra, to quote him, and that his doctrine of non-violence has been simplified to passivity, when it really is so much more than that. So what does Norman say about Ghandi, having read him? A couple of things that I think are useful to reflect on. He said that as a political strategist, he's quite brilliant. So he's able to gauge the limitations and the reserves of his people and his oppressor. He's able to, through political intuition, really feel out and sense where the public is, and design a strategy that will galvanize them to action based on that intuitive understanding of what they're prepared for. And he also has an intuitive understanding, political understanding of his enemies. So he's able to, feel out the limitations of their reserves. So therefore find their Achilles heel and, exploit that. But having said that his political strategy was brilliant, he was also the leader of a devout spiritual community, and that community was cult-like or sect-like in its discipline and its requirements of behaviour. So it was called satyagraha, which means to hold on to the truth, and it was really in order to be a Satyagri, is that how you say it? Satyagri? I don't know how to say that. You had to comply with Gandhi's behavioural standards and disciplines, and that meant, no sex, no fraternisation, no underwear, no playing, partaking in labour, early rising, all these sorts of requirements, and that he directed that spiritual community from, what he said was his inner voice. So he, in his writing, notes that he doesn't make decisions from a place of reasoned thought, that he makes decisions from a place of prayer, and that in his community he is authoritarian. It's not a democracy. His edicts are not subject to debate or scrutiny, because he believes that he has been divinely chosen to lead the community, and he's the most practiced person in the doctrine of Satyagraha. Where it becomes confused is that he in his rationale for his doctrine of non-violence, he draws on his spiritual understanding of evolution, the evolution of the human soul, so that he categorises non-violence in three ways. So he said the act of non-violent resistance is the most noble thing that you can do. But it's not simply Gene Sharp recognises that you might have to absorb some violence, or some people might end up absorbing violence, and the capacity that this has to generate sympathy in the broader community and to malign the regime. He recognises that. Gandhi takes that quite a bit further and states that non-violent resistance is the courage to die willingly and gladly, so that you should be able to walk into the bayonet of the enemy and throw yourself on it. That is an act of non-violence, because that will not only generate consensus in the broader community of the rightness of your moral position, but will also purify the enemy. So there's a real spiritual kind of dividend that he sees in getting people, satyagrahi, to walk to their death willingly and gladly. And he describes it as going in to get your head cracked is the noblest way to die. So he has that as his standard of non-violence. He says that if you say that what you're doing is non-violence to flee from the enemy because you're afraid, that's the worst thing you can be. And he describes people who do that as the most contemptible of human creatures, non-deserving of life. So he really thinks that courage is the most noble thing, the most noble state that you can acquire, and cowardice is the most shameful state that you can inhabit. And people who use the doctrine of non-violence as the reason why they are fleeing the enemy, when the real reason is cowardice or wanting to preserve their life, are the most contemptible of all human creatures, he describes them. So he says that if you can't walk willingly into the bayonet of the enemy, the very least you can do is resist violently. The worst thing you can do is run away. And he says that it's not just running away to preserve your own life that is cowardice. You are actually committing violence on other people, because if you refuse to put your body on the line in defense of your brethren, you are effectively committing an act of violence to your brethren. So you are allowing violence to descend upon them and doing nothing to protect them. So when you really think about that standard of non-violence, so to be willing to die or to be willing to fight and to overcome the desire to flee, it really is quite far removed from popular understandings of Ghandi as peace-loving and violence-rejecting as a figurehead. So that's one part of his doctrine. But the other thing that Norman says is that all of his writing is shot through with contradiction. So he has a couple of things that he really prioritizes. One is principles. So he says that there is a lot of grey areas where you can compromise in strategies, and you need to look at every individual case. But the key principle, such as the nobility of non-violence, is, immovable, is something that he won't compromise on. The other is that he's a man of action. So he says that he is, he finds theorising in ivory towers repugnant, that he is here to get things done, and that he's going to have to compromise to be able to do that to some extent, so long as he doesn't compromise the key principles. Mirrors a little bit Saul Alinsky. So Saul Alinsky, who I did the first week, Rules for Radicals, was all about getting the job done, so getting the result, and whatever means you have to employ to get to that ends is fine, so long as you get the results that you need. Ghandi is more, he says the means do count. And there are inviolable principles, but that, he's a man of action. And that means that, what did he say? Inconsistency was unavoidable in the application of theory. So you have those couple of components to him. So his idea of non-violence, very different to what the popular understanding is. His authoritarian approach to his role as leader of his spiritual community. Incidentally, it was, there's quotes in the book, about his pronouncements of, the spiritual path that people needed to take, or his, people in his community needed to take. There's one he says, in a speech to a crowd of women, he says, "I know your sex and your needs better than you do yourselves," to an audience of women in a conference. In terms of the popular discourses of feminism, and it doesn't really, it certainly doesn't really fit. So there's a lot of kind of misconceptions around him. But as a man of action and a reformer, there is the other important thing that he was able to do, which was to distinguish between his spiritual community, the requirements that he had of them to be, maintain a disciplined behaviour and spiritual practice and follow his, edicts, was one thing. But he could separate them from the popular community, so the broader community. And he understood that if you take these strict moral requirements or spiritual requirements and try and get the broader community to galvanize around them, you're not going to be able to do that. He said the key thing was to gauge where the community is at and get them to act on what they already know is wrong. So he uses, when he's talking about that, the example of smoking. So in his spiritual community, smoking was interdit, it was not allowed. But he understood that smoking being very popular in the broad community, if he tried to, fast in order to get the community to comply with his moral standards, that it wasn't going to work. So what he saw his role as was getting a sense of which way the political wind was blowing. And when the community was ready to act on something that they already knew was wrong. It was Gandhi's role to organise them and focus them into that action. So through demonstrating his willingness to self-sacrifice, or the willingness of his community to self-sacrifice, would galvanise the community to act on something that they already knew was wrong. Incidentally, he didn't believe in, he didn't like communists. They weren't allowed in his spiritual community. He didn't believe in class struggle, most of the, if we certainly look at Saul Alinsky's breakdown of where the war needs to be fought, it was along those class lines. So he was very clear about that. Gene Sharp isn't talking about class, but he's certainly talking about an elite power and an oppressed majority. Gandhi has a very idealised view of the capitalist class. So he said his hope was that through demonstrating moral purity by doing things like fasting, by employing the doctrine of non-violence in the way he described it, you would be demonstrating to the capitalist class the moral significance of your group of people, and that would inspire them to change, and that would inspire them to be benevolent or to share resources more equally. He even wrote a letter to Hitler, which was started off "Dear Friend," and he described that letter as saying, trying to melt the heart of the enemy through compassionate love of all human beings. So, what you think about that as a political strategy is, probably depends on one's own spiritual view. But in terms of the possibility of melting Hitler's heart, it seems an unlikely proposition. What can we really say about Gandhi in contemporary times? I think it's difficult to apply his spiritual component to a culture that has been so consumed by, to a capitalist culture in times of advanced, in a democratic culture in times of advanced capitalism that has prioritised to some extent secularism, with varying degrees of success. But I think the important lesson from Gandhi is that he used his political intuition to help him feel out the limitations of the people he was trying to mobilise. So when we looked at Saul Alinsky, it was about bringing people together. Gene Sharp was about getting those people to feel safe in the incremental demonstration of their agreement with each other in the illegitimacy of the regime. Gandhi is about getting people, pricking the conscience of the public and getting them to act on what they already know is wrong. So that there are things that are happening every day around people that they know is wrong, but they can't do anything about it. There's, so many things happening, and maybe they're not ready, maybe they're a bit kind of nonchalant about certain things, but using your political intuition to gauge when a community is ready for a change, and then acting as some kind of, deliberately acting as some kind of catalyst for that change. I think if we think of that in terms of the Trump administration, there's certainly a sense that people are ready for some type of change, but perhaps the political intuition on what that change is not particularly focused. Or maybe it's just that there is so many groups that have a sensing that it's mobilising around different ideas of what change is necessary. But I think the importance of political intuition is really the thing that Norman highlights as one of the most important and aspects of Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolence. So that's Ghandi. I thought next week or over the next couple of weeks I would do a book called Life and Death, Essays by Andrea Dworkin. She's my favourite feminist because she's the most radical, and she writes beautifully and passionately, and really from intellectually but also from the heart. So I thought as well it might be, it's almost worth doing a different series on the feminists, because they really stake out very different positions, and it's it's disheartening to see feminism reduced to its most uninspired form. So really just liberal feminism has certainly a place and has value, but in terms of the depth of the reform that it was trying to inspire, it is probably the least lively. But anyway, next week I'll just do Andrea Dworkin, and not next week, in the next couple of weeks. So that's it, I guess. Thank you for listening. Okay, bye.